The last stand at Mercy Creek *. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted gold by the dying light of another scorching day. Heat waves shimmered above the cracked earth, making the distant mountains dance like mirages. Frank pulled his hat lower over his eyes and checked the position of the sun. They had maybe an hour of light left, and the old homestead was still a mile away. Behind him, Sarah Beth lay motionless on the dusty ground where she had collapsed 20 minutes earlier. Her face was pale beneath the layer of desert grit, her breathing shallow but steady. The fever had taken hold 3 days ago, and despite Frank's efforts to keep her cool and hydrated, she was getting worse. Young Jimmy stood beside his sister's still form, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. At 12 years old, he was trying hard to be brave, but Frank could see the fear in the boy's eyes. They had been traveling for a week, fleeing the drought that had destroyed their farm back in Kansas, hoping to reach Frank's brother's ranch in Arizona territory. Is she going to die? Jimmy asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind across the desert floor. Frank knelt beside Sarah Beth and placed his hand gently on her forehead. The fever burned through her skin like fire, and her lips were cracked from dehydration despite the water he had been giving her throughout the day. They were down to their last canteen, and the nearest town was still 2 days' ride away. She's strong, Frank said, though his own voice carried doubt. Your sister's the strongest person I know. But even as he spoke the words, Frank felt the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him like the desert heat. When their parents had died in the influenza outbreak back home, he had promised to take care of Sarah Beth and Jimmy. He had brought them out here, convinced that a fresh start was what they all needed. Now Sarah Beth was dying in the middle of nowhere, and it was his fault. The abandoned homestead ahead offered their only hope of shelter for the night. Frank had spotted it earlier through his field glasses, a small adobe house with a well that might still have water. If they could make it there, maybe Sarah Beth would have a chance to recover. Jimmy, Frank said, making his decision. I'm going to carry your sister to that house. You think you can walk a little further? The boy nodded solemnly. He had been walking for hours without complaint, his boots worn thin, and his clothes dusty from the trail. Like his sister, Jimmy had inherited their father's stubborn determination, the kind that kept a person moving, even when everything seemed hopeless. Frank gathered Sarah Beth in his arms, surprised by how light she felt. She had always been small, but the fever and the hard traveling had made her seem fragile as a bird. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the heat radiating from her body. They made their way slowly across the desert floor, Jimmy walking beside Frank with the quiet determination of someone much older than his years. The homestead grew larger as they approached, its adobe walls still solid despite years of abandonment. A wooden porch stretched across the front, offering blessed shade, and Frank could see the dark circle of a well near the side of the house. Please let there be water, Frank whispered to himself as they reached the porch. He settled Sarah Beth gently on a patch of smooth ground in the shade, then went to investigate the well. The wooden bucket was still attached to a rope, though both showed signs of weathering. Frank lowered the bucket into the darkness and heard the splash he had been praying for. The water that came up was clear and cool, a miracle in this harsh landscape. Frank filled his canteen and hurried back to Sarah Beth, lifting her head gently and letting a few drops trickle between her parched lips. She stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering, and Frank felt a surge of hope. Sarah Beth, he said softly. Can you hear me? Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually finding his face. Frank, she whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling. I'm here, he said, offering her more water. We're safe now. There's water here, and shelter. Jimmy knelt beside his sister, taking her hand in both of his. You scared me, he said, trying to sound stern but failing to hide his relief. Sarah Beth managed a weak smile. Takes more than a little fever to get rid of me, she said, though they all knew how close she had come to something much worse than a little fever. As the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Frank explored the abandoned homestead. The previous owners had left behind some useful items, a few canned goods, some blankets, and most importantly, a small supply of medicine that included quinine for fever. That night, As Sarah Beth slept peacefully for the first time in days, Frank sat on the porch with Jimmy and looked out at the star-filled desert sky. The crisis had passed, but it had changed something in all of them. They had faced the possibility of loss and found strength they didn't know they possessed. Frank, Jimmy said quietly, I've been thinking, maybe we shouldn't go to Uncle Tom's ranch after all. Frank looked at the boy with surprise. What, you mean? Jimmy gestured toward the homestead around them. This place isn't so bad, there's water, and the house is solid. We could fix it up, maybe start over here instead of being a burden on Uncle Tom. Frank considered the idea. The homestead was isolated but habitable. The well would provide water, and the soil, though dry now, might support crops if they could manage irrigation. It would be hard work, but they had never been afraid of hard work. What does your sister think? Frank asked. I think, Sarah Beth's weak voice came from inside the house, that Jimmy's got a good idea. I'm tired of running from our problems. Maybe it's time we planted roots somewhere. Over the following weeks, as Sarah Beth regained her strength, they began to transform the abandoned homestead into a home. Frank repaired the roof and reinforced the walls. Jimmy cleared weeds from what had once been a garden. Sarah Beth, as soon as she was able, began planning how to make the most of their limited resources. The desert that had nearly claimed Sarah Beth's life gradually revealed its hidden kindness. Morning dew collected in containers they placed around the property. Wild plants provided food and medicine. The isolation that had seemed so threatening became a source of peace and self-reliance. Months later, as Frank watched the sunset paint the desert gold once again, he realized that sometimes the greatest victories came not from reaching your original destination, but from finding the courage to build something new where you least expected it. Sarah Beth emerged from the house, her health fully restored, carrying a letter that had arrived with a passing traveler. It's from Uncle Tom, she said with a smile. He's heard about our homestead from other folks passing through. Says he's proud of us for making our own way. Jimmy ran up from the garden, his arms full of vegetables they had managed to coax from the desert soil. Look what grew, he said with excitement. I told you this place had good bones. Frank put his arms around both of them, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. They had come to the desert as refugees, running from loss and hardship. But they had found something here worth more than gold, the knowledge that home wasn't a place you found, but something you built with the people you loved. The desert wind whispered across the homestead, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the possibilities it would bring.